contact group worried about their health. And by the nature of having these tests, we know that about these people. So they're not rational in making these medical decisions. So they become a consumer who's advertised to about new drugs, new investigations, new medical procedures, and then they lobby their doctors for these things, which are not clinically necessary, but they're acting through the manipulation of vulnerable patients. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a significant harm. It brings about anxiety, which actively is detrimental to health. So, on a side note, general advertising to society that worry about your genes, give us your money, that is not helpful to society as a whole. People go to their doctors when they're ill, and doctors screen people for things that they're likely of having to make them ill. So that's not helpful to society, but it's helpful to the bottom lines of these private companies. So any promise to anonymize data is also impossible because it's literally identifies you and is unique to you. Your Y chromosome is preserved in your family name. An article in the journal Science in 2013 shows that with a small amount of genetic data sold from 23andMe, you can find out and match up the person to the genome. Point number 5, any data you give away. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you.
We'll now hear the second opposition from Mr. Omar Haider.
Ladies and gentlemen, today on Side Opposition, I will aim to talk to you about how direct-to-consumer genetic testing works on a macro scale to aid the overall healthcare provided in this country to those who request the services, which is in direct extension from what my colleague talked about on a more micro scale and how it benefits the individual. For those of you who have, newly entered the debate and come in late, this is an Oxford and Cambridge varsity debate which is arguing the access that consumers have for between 100 and 200 pounds to receive their own genetic information and have it interpreted by a company, and if they wish further, by a genetic counsellor, for them to understand what diseases they are predisposed to. To prove to you today why we must not regret the rise of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, I have given myself the burden of proving to you the usefulness of genetic data collected by these companies in research and the implications that has on personalized pharmacogenomics and personalized medicine, as well as diet and lifestyle adaptations. And then go on to talk about the benefits this has onto wider society, the NHS, and organizations such as NICE. First, I'd like to start with some rebuttal, however. The first criticism proposed by Side Proposition was that this test has false negatives. They did not state the frequency of false negatives, they did not state the accuracy of these results, which I will go on to explain, are very highly regulated. And so just claiming that a test, like all tests, will have false negatives is not enough to regret it, right? No, thank you, no, thank you. And second off, they made, I guess, on the theme of alternative facts we've been hearing recently, they made a claim that mutations are somehow being wiped out from all of our genomes and people are not, barely anyone actually has any genetic predisposition to any disease for some reason. However, as Ben clearly pointed out, 50% of people with the BRCA1 mutation who leads to breast cancer, who leads to breast cancer, did not have any familial history of the disease. And so therefore, this is simply untrue. Now on to my main points. The first point I'd like to rebut, and which I will be proposing, is the usefulness of such data in research. The second speaker on Side Proposition gave a very passionate, eloquent speech about how the data you're being used is being sold to big pharma and large companies which are using it just to benefit their own bottom line. However, what he failed and purposefully omitted was that this data is anonymized, and that any data
on that point,
go on.
We told you how it can't be anonymized. 2013, paper in Science using only the publicly available data and data from 23andMe shows you cannot anonymize an individual's genome. Using publicly available data, you can find out who they are.
Okay, fine. That's assuming that these people who do have the services have had their genomes sequenced and by another service which then allows it to be public. You cannot, my genetic information has never been sequenced in my history. And it's not available, no, thank you, and it's not available online. So first of all, I'd like to go on to talk about the usefulness of such data. And it has been researched that the data which is anonymized and sent by 23andMe can be used in up to 230 studies on average. And so a survey conducted by Johns Hopkins told us that 94% of people who opt into genetic research studies, 94% of them did it out of curiosity, while 91% of them, like the people who subscribe to 23andMe, wanted to know about the genetic predispositions they hold. And so, therefore, from this we can see that the information that we collect from these services could quite conceivably result in a collective bettering of diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis for the
Point of
various
information.
information. No, thank you. I will no longer be taking any more points of information for the remainder of the speech. Thank you. I'd like to go on to talk about the specific benefits of such data and studies in the case of cancer pharmacogenetics. As we now understand that different mutations that are the main primary causes of such cancers respond to different drugs with different efficacies. And so we can see that tamoxifen, which is the kind of broad drug given for people with breast cancer, is actually not effective and there has been resistance developed in 65% of patients. Also, Dr. Kaufman of Johns Hopkins University has stated that 34% of people who have gone on to have such genetic testing have influenced their diet, and 14% of people have increased their exercise. And so therefore we see that this information can be useful in motivating people to take the next step in bettering their overall healthcare, and is not the be-all and end-all. It's not a diagnosis, it's a nudge in the right direction. Next on, I'd like to talk about how such testing benefits the wider society, the NHS, and life. Guess I'm not going to be doing that.
We'll now have the third proposition, the summary from Christian Holland.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. There's two reasons that side proposition win the debate tonight. That is because the rise of direct-to-consumer genetic testing is, one, harmful to the individual, and two, harmful to society. Before I justify those conclusions, I want to do one piece of rebuttal to the speaker we've just heard. So, the bulk of the positive material in that speech is telling us that actually the societal benefits from this data derive from the fact that it can be used in some way to better medical treatment. There are two main reasons why that is simply not the case. The first is that we live in a data excess age of medicine. Right? We've got the 100,000 Genomes project going on, and we've got no shortage of volunteers who are happy to spit in a jar, give us all their medical information, and allow us to follow them up. There is no shortage of data. In fact, the problem is trying to interpret the data we currently have. So there's no need for an excess of data. But the second point, on that same point, is that this kind of data is actually a terrible resource. Right? Because if you have to remain anonymized, then literally all you have is a genome and a person that may not be happy for you to follow them up for their entire life, asking what conditions they get, when, how they respond to different drugs. Or a person who, actually falls into a specific subset of people in the first place, who are the kind of people who are hypochondriac and wealthy enough to buy these tests. So it's not a diverse resource, and it's not an easily followed up resource. So that's why we don't think much material comes as the second opposition to the speech. So why do we win the two areas of clash in this debate? The first is the benefit to the individual. So in the first opposition case, we heard a lot about how the individual will benefit if you pick up something like a BRCA mutation. I think Ewan dealt with this quite well by telling you that actually the chances of that happening are A, vanishingly small, and B, already kind of taken care of as far as we can by the use of organisations that maximise utility, organisations like NICE. So if there is any kind of realistic chance of you having a BRCA mutation, it is likely that genetic testing will be offered to you. If you go and have a spare £150 lying around and you have a vanishingly small chance of having a BRCA mutation, but decide anyway that you're a sufficient hypochondriac to want to purchase that testing, then we've shown you, no thank you, that there are harms that come out of this. Specifically, there are three harms, and that's come out through all of proposition. The first is that you receive a positive and you don't have the means to have that followed up. So an easy characterization here would be, an American who's got $150 lying around. Enough to get one of these tests, but not enough to pay $3,000 to go and see a clinical geneticist or have the appropriate follow-up. No, thank you. So we see that as a harm because then, that individual is living with a high level of anxiety of knowing they're predisposed to a condition without necessarily having the means to do anything about it. In the UK system, a similar harm emerges, but at the societal level. Yeah, sure.
Do you have any evidence for the increased levels of anxiety following on from genetic testing?
Oh, sure. I mean, if you go and tell me that I've got a 40% predisposition to having cancer, I feel like I'd be fairly anxious. I'm not entirely sure that's a fair thing to ask for evidence for. No, thanks. So if we take that into the UK level, we can see the societal harms. because actually this provides a backdoor into healthcare that's normally provided on the basis of need, not on the basis of ability to pay. So for every person who comes and receives a positive result from a 23andMe genetic test and gets into the NHS, that's resources that would otherwise be distributed on the basis of need exactly. So we think that's a way of subverting organisations that provide maximal utility, and therefore we see a big societal harm there. Okay, 2. So leading on to the societal level, why do we win that side of the debate? So Ewan's told us a lot about the dodgy use of data, and I personally found it terrifying when we had a group chat on Facebook about this. I went and posted a link to 23andMe, immediately went back to my newsfeed and saw a targeted advert at the top telling me to buy one of their genetic tests. That's quite a scary use of data. The real scary use of data, though, as Ewan outlined, is that actually these companies exist to make the most money they can. So at the moment they're building up a data bank on as many people as they can, and in their terms and conditions they're allowed to sell that in certain ways to people. So American legislation exists to protect people from it being sold to insurance companies. What it doesn't protect you from is selling to life insurance companies and disability allowance companies. So there are loopholes that these companies can get through to make some pretty nefarious use of this data, which they will do, no thank you, you're out of time, as their MO to make the most utility from the data they have. Secondly, why is there harm here? Because if people have been screened and shown a predisposition to a certain condition, we again see those problems of anxiety, and we see the societal problems of them going and pestering their GPs and finding a way into a service which is normally accessed only on the basis of clinical need, rather than the ability to pay, find a backdoor in, and we think that's a harm on the societal level. So ladies and gentlemen, because direct-to-consumer genetic testing is bad for the individual, because it's bad for society as a whole, we beg you to propose, and we are proud to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hahn. We'll now hear the third opposition, a summary to Mr. Atiq Sayed.
Hello everyone, I am the final speaker for the debate, which means that if you haven't fallen asleep already, it's my job to either wake you up or just push you into the brink of unconsciousness. But failing that, I'm going to have to summarise some of the main points, and before I get into it, I just want to briefly talk about the changing face of the medical profession. Over the past 50 years, the profession that I'm going to go into as a medical student has gone from having a doctor tell you what to do to empowering the patient. And this is something that we are taught in our classrooms. It's what current practitioners are taught in professional development. So it's about taking power away from the doctor, giving it to the patient, and allowing them to look at their choices, make their own decisions. And I think that's going to be important in this debate. First, I'm going to talk about why I think that the proposition are wrong. So first, they've mentioned false positives. Now, this is like completely just irrelevant. That no professionals are questioning the efficiency of the labs that are carrying out these tests. So in the US, they comply with CLIA recommendations, and the UK has its own recommendations to these companies for stringent lab procedures, which are easy to follow. This is a well-developed sequencing technology.
Point of information.
No, thank you. Next, we've heard a lot about genetic counselling. So I'm going to give some facts. I'm not going to assume that the people using this are hypochondriacs. I'm not going to assume that the people here are just anxious about their data. I'm going to present data to you, right? A 2014 paper found that there was no single intervention of counselling that was uniformly effective. Dr. Andrea Farkas-Paternard, a psychology professor at Harvard, no thank you, said that those who knew their results indicate, this is direct-to-consumer genetic testing, those who knew that their results gave them a cancer risk are not likely to develop pathologies. Dr. Ludwig Hennemann at Vrije University said after an extensive study and psychoanalysis, genetic risk has little or no association with anxiety or distress. And a survey of 2,500 participants found that there were no differences in baseline anxiety and that 96.8% of people had no test-related distress. No, thank you. So this is the data, right? This is showing that people, firstly, we're not screening for serious diseases like Huntington's. Those diseases are offered by, screenings are offered by the NHS, right? This is minor diseases, minor risk factors that actually do not cause these people that much anxiety. No, thank you. No, thank you. Right. Next, the proposition raised the idea that Well, firstly, we are in the UK, so the US isn't really relevant here. If you want genetic counselling, talk to your GP, they give you genetic counselling, right? So they mentioned NICE. NICE offers genetic screening, but not ones that it finds cost effective. Now this is where these companies come in. They're filling this hole. If you want to learn more about yourself, then you can, and
What a
here's
point of
how.
information.
No, thank you. Next, they're talking about terms and conditions, and now they pose the question to us, the audience, have you ever read the terms and conditions? Well, I'd like to pose a question to them. Have you ever read the terms and conditions? You see, if you'd actually read them, the top 3 companies, 23andMe and the other big 2, in their contractual obligation have said, we will inform you and obtain your consent before we pass your data on. And on top of that, right, they are subject to UK regulations and recommendations. That includes the Common Framework of Principles established by the Human Genetics Commission, which also regulates marketing and advertising, but also regulates consent and data protection. So why do I think we're right? Well, firstly, what do people get out of it? Now, again, we're not making assumptions about people here. 94% of people, the vast majority of people, the biggest group of people said the only reason they did it, one of the reasons they did it was just out of curiosity, finding out more about themselves, building their own identity, and we think that's really important, right? Just to facilitate a consumer's frivolities. Here, it's direct-to-consumer genetic testing. The capital C is on the consumer. We're offering people what they want and what they desire. And 80% of consumers said that they derived satisfaction or empowerment from simply knowing about their own genome. The second reason we think it's important is support for those with conditions. Now, Sandra Lee, a senior researcher at Stanford University, said that half of people shared their direct-to-consumer results on Facebook, and that 2/3 of people went online.
Thank you, Mr. Saeed.
Thank you. Proud to oppose.